instigating a flexible opening. A knight ventures out, probing for central influence without committing to a rigid pawn structure. A symmetrical response, mirroring the knight's development and preparing for a fluid positional battle rather than an early clash of armies. Asserting central influence and preparing to contest the d5 square. This pawn thrust immediately stakes a claim in the middle game. Embracing a fianchetto signals a long-term vision, preparing for King's Indian defensive structures and potentially challenging White's central ambitions with a bishop's diagonal influence. Securing the d4 outpost and preparing further central expansion shows good developmental intent. Developing the bishop to g7 fianchetto immediately challenges the central control White is attempting to establish. Establishing central control. This advance prepares to contest key squares and potentially build a formidable pawn chain. Securing the king initiates a phase of subtle piece deployment, prioritizing king's safety over immediate central confrontation. Commanding the center. This pawn thrust boldly claims territory and opens diagonals for piece activity. Solidifying the center and preparing to challenge White's central pawn chain paves the way for piece activity. Establishing central control and preparing for kingside castling are the primary aims here. Aiming for a solid, flexible position from which White can later develop an initiative. Opening the center with e5 immediately challenges White's central pawns, creating a dynamic imbalance and potentially opening lines for your pieces. But be mindful of the increased tactical possibilities and the potential for White to gain a spatial advantage if you mismanage the ensuing complications. Pushing the d-pawn forward like this abruptly closes the center, creating a pawn chain that, while limiting Black's central influence for now, can become a target if White fails to support it adequately and could restrict the mobility of White's own pieces, particularly the queen's bishop, opening up the queenside for future queenside play. This gambit-like pawn advance immediately questions White's central space advantage, creating dynamic imbalance. Bolstering the kingside defense. This move preempts any potential bishop or knight incursions through g4, effectively solidifying White's pawn structure and creating a secure outpost for the g2 bishop. A curious repositioning, aiming to connect rooks and perhaps prepare a central break later on. But it cedes valuable central squares and doesn't immediately address the cramped queenside. Centering the bishop here prepares to contest the e-file and potentially reinforce the d5 pawn, while also offering a retreat square should Black's pawn push advance further. The knight's journey to the edge of the board signals a fascinating attempt to destabilize White's kingside pawn structure, potentially opening lines for the bishop and creating new attacking avenues, though the piece finds itself somewhat isolated for now. Opening the path for the queen's rook to potentially join the kingside assault. This knight repositions to a more flexible square, prepared to support a central pawn push or redeploy to a more active square on the kingside, like f3 or g4, while simultaneously denying Black's knight a comfortable outpost on e3. The knight's daring leap to f4, while seemingly aggressive, sacrifices a tempo and relinquishes central influence. Black boldly ventures into uncharted territory, hoping to disrupt White's queenside expansion and target the king's flank. But this premature knight sortie might leave the kingside vulnerable to a future pawn storm and exposes the Black king to a potential central breakthrough. Refocusing the bishop to the king's defense after a slightly overextended knight dance. This repositioning aims to secure the monarch from potential kingside threats while preparing to support a potential kingside expansion or control the central dark squares. Embarking on an aggressive kingside pawn thrust. This challenging maneuver seeks to rupture white's meticulously constructed center and unleash the knight on f4, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonals for the bishop on g7. Shielding the king while preparing a pawn advance to gain space on the queenside is the ambitious idea behind this move. The knight's retreat to the edge of the board offers a subtle repositioning, potentially aiming to provoke weaknesses in white's pawn structure or find a safer square from which to influence the kingside. This maneuver might anticipate a pawn advance on the g-file by white, seeking to escape immediate confrontation and prepare for a more active role later in the game. Striking at the pawn chain. White disrupts black's carefully constructed defensive barrier, forcing a decision on the f-file and opening potential avenues for future piece activity towards the kingside. Opening the g-file. Black invites a more open game, potentially creating attacking chances on the kingside despite white's central pawn majority. This pawn structure dramatically alters the pawn dynamics and the flow of the ensuing middle game. Reconsidering the knight's outpost, white opts to redeploy the bishop, aiming to secure the central dark squares and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, perhaps with b4. Though the immediate task remains to counter black's pawn storm advancing on the kingside in the looming e-file pressure. This retreat to f6, while seemingly passive, aims to consolidate the knight's position and prepare for a more robust central presence, potentially rerouting it to d7 or e8 if the opportunity arises, while also creating a slight pawn structure imbalance on the kingside by abandoning the dark squares around the king, initiating a flank pawn thrust to shatter the existing pawn structure, aiming to pry open lines for your pieces and disrupt black's kingside solidity. The knight's journey to the edge of the board, na6, aims to dislodge white's robust pawn chain and open the queenside for black's forces. It's a bold maneuver, sacrificing immediate central influence for the promise of future queenside pressure and potentially targeting the c4 pawn. This repositioning forces white to consider their pawn structure and how to respond to the growing queenside activity, a stark contrast to the earlier fight for central dominance. White reinforces the knight's central presence, seeking to contest the d5 outpost and potentially open the f-file should black choose to maintain tension with f4, which would then lead to a more open game. Conceding the pawn structure with this capture opens up the f-file for white's rooks, creating immediate attacking potential towards your king's defenses. Unleashing the bishop redirects its gaze, aiming to pierce through black's pawn chain and exploit the newly opened diagonal toward the weakened kingside, reactivating the knight to its original square after a brief excursion. nh5 seems to signal a rethinking of its purpose, perhaps seeking a more passive role or preparing to swing over to the kingside again. But it neglects the open files and the potential pressure on white's d4 pawn. Seizing the d-file with the queen signals an intent to contest control of the center and potentially launch an assault on black's kingside, where the knight has oddly retreated. The knight's journey to c5, a seemingly simple repositioning, actually seeks to unravel white's central grip by exploiting the subtle weaknesses created by white's pawn structure and the bishop on e3. This maneuver is less about immediate threats and more about subtly reshaping the battlefield, aiming to create future attacking avenues or exchange off a key defender of the white king's sanctuary. Observe how this piece aims to disrupt white's harmonious pawn formation and potentially open lines for black's rook on a8. Unleashing the rook to the g-file signals a decisive attempt to crack open black's kingside fortifications, aiming to exploit the somewhat exposed nature of the black king after its queenside maneuvers. Black boldly probes the central weakness, daring white to overextend and potentially creating a dangerous outpost for the knight. The knight's relocation to e4 injects immediate tactical complexity, forcing a re-evaluation of black's central control and potentially opening lines toward the king. A bold recapture, opening the f-file for potential queen activity and creating a new pawn outpost at e4, but simultaneously exposing the black king to threats down the g-file. This knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to control the central squares and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure. The knight's retreat to f4 abandons the crucial g5 square, a potential outpost for white's forces, while simultaneously creating a pleasant dilemma for black. Either allow white's knight to establish itself on d4, further centralizing white's influence, or capture the knight, which would open the f-file for white and potentially lead to a dangerous kingside attack. Opening the g-file with this pawn advance instantly creates immediate attacking possibilities and significantly weakens black's king safety, forcing them to dedicate resources to defending the open territory. Re-establishing queenly presence on the e-file aims to disrupt white's central control and prepare for a potential counterattack along the open lines, eyeing the vulnerable kingside. A strategic redeployment, the queen elegantly repositions, seeking to exploit the now vulnerable light squares around black's king and potentially support a central advance or a kingside assault. The black queen, suddenly finding itself on a captivating diagonal, now endeavors to exploit the exposed nature of white's monarch by delivering a potent check. The king's safety, an absolute priority, is now severely compromised as it ventures into the open, a glaring vulnerability inviting further tactical aggression. A daring raid into enemy territory. This queen sacrifice aims to exploit the white king's exposed position, potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces. Steering the queen away from the immediate danger and redeploying the rook to the open file now. Prepares to contest the crucial central space. A brave but potentially risky decision. This exchange dramatically simplifies the position. By sacrificing the queen for the rook, black immediately transitions into an endgame where the material imbalance might become overwhelming if white's king isn't sufficiently exposed. The open files, particularly the g-file now controlled by white's rook, could become a significant problem for black's remaining pieces if they can't generate immediate counterplay. This opens the door for a swift attack if white can capitalize on the initiative. The white king, now exposed in the center, immediately embraces its newfound freedom, seeking sanctuary and actively participating in the emerging endgame battlefield, a stark contrast to the previous, more delicate maneuvering. The bishop's excursion to the kingside, although seemingly aggressive, unravels black's kingside pawn structure and exposes the king prematurely, clearing the back rank for immediate counterplay. This exchange is crucial for activating the rook and challenging black's pawn structure. A judicious retreat, reclaiming the rook to a more active file after the exchange, which simplifies the position and prepares for potential endgame maneuvering. Targeting the weak b7 pawn, nb5 seeks to exploit black's pawn structure and potential king safety issues, forcing a response that could solidify white's control or create further imbalances. The rook now eyes the open f-file, a vital artery for its offensive potential, aiming to disrupt white's currently solidified pawn structure and potentially penetrate further into enemy territory. Opening the c-file now disrupts black's pawn structure, creating immediate attacking possibilities for white's rooks and potentially exposing the black king if any more defenders are exchanged. Shattering the central pawn chain opens aggressive avenues for white's rook and queen, forcing black to carefully consider the now exposed king and the advanced c-pawn's potential. Unleashing the d-pawn into the enemy camp. This aggressive thrust suddenly injects significant pressure, aiming to crack open black's pawn structure and potentially expose the king. Attempting to solidify the center after a pawn sacrifice. This move concedes a crucial passed pawn for white and a structural weakness on the queenside. Unleashing the knight to c7 injects immediate pressure, aiming to exploit the awkward placement of black's bishop and potentially disrupt their queenside structure with the pawn push. Navigating the king to safety appears paramount as the opponent's knight looms, threatening to invade the central territory, while the pawn structure on the queenside presents an opportunity for further penetration. Relocating the king offers a sanctuary from immediate threats, simultaneously preparing to reclaim the pawn on d6, which is currently the sole defender of the c7 square, potentially leading to a more active rook presence on the open file. Opening up a critical diagonal. This advance creates an immediate danger for the opposing king, leveraging the newly acquired activity of the e-pawn to penetrate the enemy's camp. The monarch boldly steps into the fray, seeking refuge amongst its own pawns and aiming to support the advance of the d-pawn, now a significant threat. Opening up the bishop to attack the pawn on d6. Black aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially create weaknesses, clearing the way for the knight to infiltrate the weakened queenside defense at c7. This bishop repositioning strategically aims to disrupt black's newly formed pawn chain and potentially exploit the open lines for future attacks. Securing the open c-file and potentially entangling the passed d-pawn is the immediate aim here, even if it means sacrificing the bishop to achieve it. Liberating the bishop from its defensive pawn chain to attack the rook on f8 reopens the position, creating dynamic imbalances that challenge black's king safety despite the material equality. The king, finally liberated from its cramped corner, embarks on a critical journey across the now opened diagonals, seeking safety amidst the encroaching opponent's pawns. Repositioning the knight to the rim allows it to support the pawn push on the c-file and potentially attack the weakened black king's defenses, creating a dynamic tension as the queens are off the board. The e-pawn's unexpected thrust, a bold gambit, injects a potent dose of urgency into the proceedings, aiming to destabilize the knight's cozy outpost and potentially pave a desperate path towards promotion. Repositioning the rook to the only open file offers immediate support for the beleaguered pawn and prepares to challenge the advanced black pawn's advance on the queenside. The bishop, now free from its defensive duties on d6, boldly steps onto f1, an audacious maneuver to disrupt white's rook's activity and potentially force a beneficial exchange. King venturing into the crossfire, inviting decisive checks, reveals a desperate attempt to cling to a losing position. Reactivating the bishop's diagonal opens up new avenues for counterplay, even with the material deficit, as white's king remains exposed. Resuming the material advantage, white now initiates a strategic retreat of the knight to potentially exploit open lines later or simply to avoid further exchanges. The bishop's recapture solidifies black's central pawn majority, creating a powerful advanced formation that will soon demand white's full attention. White's king bravely steps into the fray, aiming to support the pawn's final dash for queen while simultaneously initiating a defensive setup against further encroachment. The pawn's advance, though seemingly simple, creates a critical weakness on the adjacent square and prepares for potential infiltration. Opening the king's escape route while simultaneously threatening the lone pawn on h5. The pawns march down the kingside, aiming for promotion, intensifies the endgame's pressure and tests white's ability to contain its advance. The knight's relocation to the 6th rank establishes a commanding outpost, dominating central squares and posing a significant threat to black's vulnerable pawns. The black bishop now occupies a strategically vital square, poised to support its isolated pawn's advance and potentially menace white's king if it gets too adventurous. The knight's relocation to c4 aims to solidify white's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside, while also freeing up other pieces to support the advance. Seizing control of the d6 square allows the black king to become an active participant in the endgame, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure and creating counterplay. Securing the b-pawn's advance prepares to extend white's queenside pawn chain, aiming to create a passed pawn and restrict black's bishop's activity on the c-file, while simultaneously preparing a potential advance of the a-pawn. Opening up the queenside with this pawn thrust aims to create a passed pawn and potentially disrupt white's structure, but it might be too slow given white's active pieces. Liberating the a-pawn from its confinement, this gambit aims to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and seize neglected territory, potentially creating an unstoppable passed pawn down the queenside should black fail to address the immediate threat. Pushing the pawn forward aggressively opens lines, creating immediate threats and forcing the opponent to react defensively, potentially leading to tactical opportunities as the queenside pawn structure becomes dynamic. The pawn push opens up the possibility of creating a passed pawn on the queenside, but it simultaneously weakens the pawn structure on that side, potentially offering black targets for counterplay. The pawn chain on the queenside crumbles, opening up lines that might have been black's salvation earlier, but now, with queens often material scarce, it grants white's knight a direct path to c7, a crucial outpost from which to harass the kingside. Reclaiming the knight's outpost on d2 is a prudent adjustment, securing the piece after its forced retreat and preparing for a more active role in the endgame. Perhaps eyeing the vulnerable kingside pawns or supporting a potential pawn push. The pawn's advance to c4 dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating a passed pawn for black while simultaneously blockading white's central majority and opening a diagonal for the bishop. Sharpening the knight's presence in the center now poses an immediate threat to the enemy king's safety. The pawn push on c3 creates a dynamic crossroads, forcing a careful evaluation of whether the potential passed pawn is worth the positional concessions. The knight's repositioning to f2 aims to secure a defensive post, anticipating a potential push by black's pawn on e3, while keeping options open for future maneuvers towards the kingside. Sealing the pawn's fate, this advance offers a direct path to promotion, but it also exposes the black king to immediate dangers as white's pieces are poised to converge. Gaining crucial tempo, the knight repositions to a square that both shields the king and prepares to disrupt black's passed pawn's advance. The bishop, now liberated from its pawn escort, seeks greener pastures on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and perhaps assist the advanced passed pawn. The king marches forward, a daring foray into enemy territory, seeking to activate itself before the remaining pieces solidify their positions. The pawn's relentless march to the back rank, culminating in promotion, dramatically shifts the game's complexion and demands an immediate, decisive response from white to prevent an overwhelming material advantage. Seizing the initiative, the knight swoops in to reclaim the pawn and simplify into an endgame where the remaining material heavily favors white's material advantage, pushing black's now isolated queen towards a lonely existence. The queen's transformation now establishes a new dynamic. The game is all about whether black's bishop can effectively shield its newly crowned queen against white's persistent knight. Capturing the pawn. White's king ventures further into the enemy's territory. A bold foray into the newly opened territory where black's queenside pawns have been liberated. The king, a lone wanderer on an exposed flank, now has a chance to seek refuge and prepare for the rook's escort to the center. The king bravely marches forward, seeking to establish a defensive perimeter, though the newly promoted queen on the queenside presents a persistent threat. Consolidating the king's position into this central square allows it to actively participate in defending the remaining pawns and potentially support any breakthrough black might attempt later. The king embarks on a daring sortie, seeking to utilize its newfound activity to support the pawns in their advance across the board. The king's flight from the cozy fortress of its original position now exposes it to perpetual harassment in the open plains, a perilous journey for any monarch. The white king boldly marches forward, seeking to engage the pawn majority and disrupt black's coordinated assault. Pushing the king further into the enemy's territory, the black monarch seeks to exploit the weakened pawn structure and create threats on the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's coordination before the pawns can become too dangerous. Sealing the rook's influence on the b-file. This king maneuver anticipates black's queen promotion, aiming to restrict the opponent's activity and consolidate the material advantage. Sensing an opportunity, the black king boldly steps out, aiming to become an active participant in the endgame and disrupt white's pawn structure.